Pelican Bay State Prison was built to hold the inmates no other facility could control. Isolated on California's northern edge, it became a symbol of extreme incarceration, gang influence, and the controversial use of long-term solitary confinement. Based on public records, court filings, investigative journalism, and government reports, this documentary explores how Pelican Bay evolved into one of the most feared prisons in America, and what that reality means for the people locked inside and the system that created it. The first thing people notice about Pelican Bay is not the walls, or the razor wire, or even the guards standing watch from concrete towers. It's the silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet that settles over the facility like a warning. According to former staff interviews and court testimony, the prison was designed this way on purpose. Pelican Bay was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be controlled. Built in the late 1980s and opened in 1989, Pelican Bay State Prison sits near Crescent City, California, only a few miles from the Oregon border. Official state planning documents described the location as remote, secure, and ideal for housing the most disruptive inmates in the California prison system. Critics would later describe it differently: isolated, unforgiving, and nearly impossible to monitor from the outside. From the beginning, Pelican Bay was different. While most prisons evolved over decades, adding new wings and policies as problems arose, Pelican Bay was designed around a single concept: containment. According to California Department of Corrections records, the prison included a secure housing unit, known simply as the SHU, built to hold inmates deemed too dangerous for general population. These were individuals accused of leading prison gangs, orchestrating violence, or refusing to comply with institutional control. The SHU became the prison within the prison. Windowless concrete cells. Solid steel doors. Fluorescent lights that stayed on around the clock. Inmates spent at least 22.5 hours a day alone, according to court filings. Exercise, when permitted, took place in small concrete enclosures often described by inmates as dog runs, open to the sky but surrounded by high walls and steel mesh. Supporters of the SHU argued it was necessary. California prison officials testified in multiple hearings that removing gang leaders from the general population reduced violence statewide. But others questioned whether Pelican Bay was controlling gangs, or simply hardening them. According to investigative reports published in major newspapers during the 1990s and early 2000s, Pelican Bay quickly became a central hub for prison gang activity, not despite the isolation, but because of it. Inmates accused of belonging to groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla family were concentrated in one place. Locked away from the general population, they were also locked together, able to communicate through coded messages, legal mail, and indirect contact. One former corrections official, speaking in a sworn deposition during a federal civil rights case, described Pelican Bay as a pressure cooker that never released steam. According to that testimony, the longer inmates stayed in isolation, the more influence certain individuals gained. Reputation, not physical presence, became power. The public first began to pay attention to Pelican Bay in the early 1990s, when a series of lawsuits alleged that inmates were being held in solitary confinement indefinitely, sometimes for years or even decades, without clear paths to release. According to court documents, placement in the SHU was often based on gang validation, a process that relied on confidential informants, tattoos, artwork, or association with other validated inmates. Critics argued that this system was opaque and prone to abuse. In 1995, a federal class action lawsuit challenged the conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU, alleging violations of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Court filings described inmates suffering from anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. State attorneys countered that the measures were necessary for safety and that inmates in the SHU represented an ongoing threat. The judge ultimately ruled that while conditions were harsh, they did not rise to the level of unconstitutional treatment for most inmates. But the ruling came with a warning: prolonged isolation carried serious psychological risks. Despite the legal battles, Pelican Bay's reputation only grew darker. According to news reports from the late 1990s, violence inside California prisons declined overall, but incidents tied to organized prison gangs became more calculated and strategic. Investigators noted that orders were increasingly traced back to inmates housed in high-security units, including Pelican Bay. The prison had become, in effect, a command center. Former inmates interviewed by journalists described a system of communication that operated quietly and efficiently. Messages passed through legal correspondence, carefully worded to avoid detection. Instructions were memoized and relayed through intermediaries. According to law enforcement testimony, even inmates locked alone could exert influence far beyond their cells. Pelican Bay's physical isolation added another layer. The prison sits far from major cities, making oversight visits rare and family contact difficult. Advocacy groups argued that this distance reduced accountability. When problems occurred, they stayed hidden longer. One internal report cited in later litigation described Pelican Bay as operationally effective but psychologically severe. That phrase would echo in debates for years. In the early 2000s, attention shifted again as former inmates began speaking publicly about long-term solitary confinement. Some described losing track of time. Others reported struggling to speak normally after years without human interaction. Mental health experts testified in legislative hearings that sensory deprivation could have lasting effects. At the same time, prison officials maintained that Pelican Bay prevented widespread bloodshed. According to internal CDCR statistics presented to lawmakers, separating gang leadership reduced coordinated violence in other facilities. The argument was simple and chilling: better suffering in isolation than chaos everywhere else. Then, in 2011, something unprecedented happened. Hundreds of inmates across California, many housed in Pelican Bay's SHU, began a coordinated hunger strike. According to media coverage and statements from inmate representatives, the protest aimed to challenge indefinite solitary confinement and the gang validation process. The strike spread to prisons across the state, drawing international attention. State officials acknowledged the protest but disputed many of the claims. Still, the hunger strike forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Independent reviews were commissioned. Policy changes were discussed. For the first time, Pelican Bay's inner workings were being scrutinized not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. In 2015, a landmark settlement fundamentally changed how California used solitary confinement. According to the agreement, inmates could no longer be held indefinitely in the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. Pathways back to general population were established. The SHU population dropped dramatically. But the story of Pelican Bay did not end there. Former officials cautioned that while policies changed, the underlying dynamics remained. Gang influence did not disappear, it adapted. Inmates moved into general population units carried their reputations with them. According to correctional experts, the power structures built in isolation did not dissolve overnight. Pelican Bay remains one of the most secure prisons in the United States. It still houses inmates serving life sentences and those considered high risk. The SHU still exists, though under new rules. And the silence is still there.